This will require a political solution. These were the words written by Captain Brett Elliott Crozier, an Annapolis graduate and captain in command of the USS Theodore Roosevelt that had come to port at Naval Base Guam after an extended port of call in Da Nang, Vietnam. After his nuclear aircraft carrier experienced an outbreak. Requires a political solution. Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and I am the former operations officer for all U.S. Army strategic counterintelligence in the continental United States. And back in the late 1990s, I played a critical role in the formation of the intelligence activity that was supposed to have alerted the former president about an emerging health crisis in China as early as November 2019, according to George Stephanopoulos and ABC News, in a report that aired last April. And in the last segment of this video series, we began to explore some of the political considerations arising from the question as to whether a novel coronavirus was the product of a zoonotic evolution or a lab, a topical discussion by decision makers currently in Washington. However, neither elected nor appointed as a political leader and presently in a school board race without even a party affiliation, we shall depart the politics of a pandemic for the next few moments to discuss the science. And you know the science. Since the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, is the leading infectious disease control agency in the United States, not the NIAID, it would probably be a prudent course to begin with the statements from the director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, recently, which appeared in most respects to concur with her predecessor, Dr. Robert Redfield, who emphasized diplomatically that he was not expressing any statements about intentionality, diplomatically, and noting that it was his personal opinion that with regards to the present pandemic pathogen, the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory. Escaped. Hint, hint. Escaped. Wink, wink. And concurring with this highly qualified statement, Dr. Walensky this week stated to Republican Senator from Louisiana, John Kennedy, that one of the several possibilities is that the virus may have escaped from a lab. But she could not elaborate further because she had apparently arrived for a Senate hearing without her reference notes. This is not uncommon in Washington when we are dealing with what Captain Crozier so eloquently described as a situation requiring a political solution. So under, that thing we talked about. So under the science, shall we begin with this one of many possibilities, a virus escaping from a laboratory? And Dr. Redfield offered the plausible suggestion, plausible deniability, suggestion to buttress this, shall we say, theory, that it is not entirely uncommon for personnel working in laboratories to become infected while working with hazardous materials, which would raise considerable concerns to a reasonable person. But again, recall that this is what we describe as fashioning a political solution, even if in the United States there have been few, if any, instances in hospitals where we have sick people, infectious diseases, and where public health professionals in the United States have been even accidentally infected by patients suffering from COVID-19, or even nursing home staffs, where the largest outbreaks have occurred. Even in the Commonwealth of Virginia, with the largest outbreak in South Boston, with cases approaching 200. At that particular location, a hotspot amongst hotspots, but not many, if even any, staff workers, apparently more careful than government scientists working in laboratories with hazardous materials, according to Dr. Redfield, diplomatically, accidentally becoming infected. Simply amazing phenomenon, but also a fashioning a political solution. This situation in hospital or nosocomial settings, however, has not been shared in other nations like the United Kingdom and in Israel, where hospital outbreaks have been one of the leading sources of outbreaks, just like during the outbreaks of SARS in Hong Kong in 2003 and with MERS on the Arabian Peninsula in 2012 and later in South Korea in 2015, with no evidence of wider community spread, as if highly contagious and lethal pathogens hit a force field when they approach the exit door to a hospital. In science, some are familiar with the works of scientific philosopher and Harvard professor Thomas Kuhn, who developed a unified theory to explain anomalies. And this philosopher of science had posited that if one theory explains all anomalies, it is probably the correct one. Kind of like the Sherlock Holmes of science. So, testing the virus that escaped from a laboratory, one might reasonably ask how, at least in the United States, where the fatalities in nursing homes account for over half of the fatalities and are the most prominent places for outbreaks to take hold, why there appears to be no virus with even localized epidemic potential flowing out from the nursing home outbreaks. Apartment complexes would be an ideal candidate for these things to take hold in a community, suddenly having several outbreaks all over a given locality. But that has not happened. And test that anomaly with the possibility that the virus was actually created in a laboratory, which might explain its unique gain of function to be self-limiting in its damaging effects. It's a virus with a conscience that doesn't want to cause too much harm. Natural and highly contagious? Probably not. Something unnatural? This appears to be the stronger theory. Is this odd behavior by a biological particle defying probability, perhaps some alien technology, like the UFOs in the news lately that appear to do things that normal aircraft simply cannot, under how we understand aerodynamics on Earth with our science? Well, that is a theory, but we lack any science to explain that, kind of like God. However, if a pathogen perhaps had some unnatural assistance, ex deus machina, then we might be able to explain these anomalies. And in the installment, the last installment, you may recall that Barry Bloom, an immunologist and infectious disease expert at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, stated to NPR in March, "I think the genetics will tell you about the virus. I think it would be very difficult to tell you where it got into the human population and how it spread and whether it came from a lab or didn't come from a lab. I think that's going to be very hard." Well, definitely politics would present a problem, but the science, well, that is at least a half to. And we may not have to go all the way back to an examination of the genomic structure and forensics to better understand the phenomenon. I would suggest. Recall that when engineers and scientists were baffled by malaria and yellow fever back at the beginning of the 20th century, during the construction of the Panama Canal, Major Ross and Colonel Gorgas did not even know that viruses existed. True, they had been invented at the turn of the century, but news travels slow in the Army. Yet were still able, through empirical observations, able to fashion an effective prevention and mitigation effort to flatten the curve on those mosquito-borne illnesses. They could see the mosquitoes. So, beginning with the most basic facts, what is known about the pandemic pathogen? We know, on the most fundamental level, that it is a virus. We have more knowledge than Colonel Gorgas and Major Ross. We know that it is a virus, one of the most abundant biological particles in the world, something that many of us, hopefully, learned in grammar school, but which before COVID-19, there were only a total of 220 viruses that presented any threat at all to mankind, which should create a reasonable suspicion as to why or how this novel coronavirus became a pandemic pathogen at all, especially if you took a course in high school probability and statistics. It's kind of like winning the lottery, getting the trifecta. We also know that it is a coronavirus. And what do we know about those gentlemen? We know that they were first discovered in animals in 1932. Around the time, actually just before, we discovered the electron microscope, and are only present in mammals and birds, like the very first one discovered that had been the cause of chicken bronchitis, also a respiratory tract infection, but in chickens. Coronaviruses, as far as we know, only are found in the most advanced species, with the exception of cephalopods, which can be just as complex as mammals and birds that have coronaviruses, but which find their habitat in the oceans. Think of the squid and 20,000 leagues on the ship. We know that they were first found in humans, one of the most complex forms of life in 1965, but only as a marginal co-infecting agent within the common cold, presenting no particular threat to mankind by itself and requiring assistance from other co-infecting agents like noroviruses and rhinoviruses that cause even the minutest harm, and also suggesting a theory that perhaps in the origin of viruses, they actually came from us, and probably from coronaviruses, also explaining what appears to be a almost natural herd immunity to viruses generally. And we know that coronaviruses are the largest viruses in genome mass, dwarfing all other viruses. They are just huge. And this matter of size becomes important in the science of a novel coronavirus because this size creates a challenge to its very survival, making it the most unstable and prone to mutations, or just simply falling apart. And scientists have found, especially in recent years, that these large genomes, through natural selection, actually developed a stabilization zone at the center, prohibiting any mutations in that core space, just to keep the genome from falling apart and going into extinction, but also imposing a natural limit on how many possible mutations can occur. If you recall your classes on permutations and combinations from high school. So your mutations are only happening at the dangling ends. And this instability consequent to genome size presents an additional consideration for a novel coronavirus where almost every day there is news about some new mutant variant that may pose a greater threat or even evade the protection of vaccines. Coronavirus is the most abundant types of the most abundant particles in the world. And reason would dictate if they presented a natural threat, coronaviruses would have become a concern long before the period between 2003 and 2005, when just like magic, suddenly a total of 5 brand new coronaviruses sprung up, beginning with SARS in Hong Kong, and all somehow at least distant cousins to one another, as well as closely related to a bat coronavirus, for which a bat in Yunnan, another location for a virology lab in China. Chinese have even admitted that in Wuhan, they actually cultivated in vitro a bat coronavirus from that bat. Like Dr. Redfield, however, diplomatically, we are not implying in any way intentionality, and this will require a political solution. This briefing is unclassified. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.